My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 33 years old when my father called 4 days before my wedding and told me he would not be there to walk me down the aisle. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon in early October. I was standing inside my floral studio in the small town of Franklin, Tennessee, arranging white garden roses into wooden boxes I had built myself. Soft country music drifted from an old speaker near the window. My hands smelled of eucalyptus and fresh cedar. My phone buzzed across the work table. "Dad?" I smiled before answering. That smile lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Claire," he said quietly, "I've made a decision." There was something strange about his voice. Not sadness, not anger. It sounded rehearsed. "I'm not walking you down the aisle." The stem I was trimming slipped from my fingers. "What?" "I've thought about it." "No," I answered. "You obviously haven't." He sighed. "Emily isn't handling things well." Of course, Emily, my older sister, 36 years old, recently separated from her husband, mother of 2 boys, and according to my parents, the emotional center of the universe. What does Emily have to do with my wedding? She says watching me walk you down the aisle would destroy her. I waited. Surely there was more. There had to be. Instead, he quietly added, "She asked me not to." The silence stretched between us. Outside, rain tapped softly against the studio windows. Inside, I could hear the refrigerator compressor humming behind the bouquets. "So," I finally asked, "you chose her." "It's not like that." "It sounds exactly like that." He cleared his throat. "Claire, she's having a difficult year. And I'm getting married." "I know. So why does her pain cancel my joy?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then the answer came. "She said if I walked you down the aisle, she wouldn't bring the boys to Thanksgiving." There it was. Not love, not loyalty, leverage, the grandchildren. Emily had discovered years earlier that my father would surrender almost anything if she threatened to keep his grandsons away, and once she learned it worked, she never stopped using it. "I understand," I said quietly. "No, sweetheart." "I do." I ended the call. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing left to hear. 10 minutes later, my mother called, exactly as expected. She had always preferred finishing conversations my father couldn't. "Claire." "Hi, Mom. Your father told you?" "He did. I hope you're going to be reasonable." Reasonable, my mother's favorite word. It always meant one thing. "Give up quietly," she continued before I answered. "Lots of brides walk alone these days." "I don't want to walk alone." "You have Ethan. My groom is waiting at the altar." So that's different." She sighed dramatically. "Emily's marriage is collapsing, and mine is beginning. You have to think about your sister." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes laughter is the only thing standing between dignity and tears. "When?" I asked softly. "Have you ever asked Emily to think about me?" Silence, real silence. Then, "Don't make this into family drama." I didn't. "Claire, I invited you to celebrate my wedding." "We are celebrating." "No." I looked around the studio. Hundreds of flowers, months of planning, years of waiting. "No," I repeated. "You're managing Emily's emotions." Then I hung up. My fiancé, Ethan Carter, found me sitting on the back steps of the studio almost half an hour later. He didn't ask what happened. He looked at my face and simply sat beside me. We stayed there for several minutes, listening to the rain. Finally he spoke. "Your dad?" I nodded. He backed out. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. I figured. "You figured?" "He called me yesterday." I turned. "He what?" He asked if I'd understand. "You never told me. I wanted him to tell you himself." That hurt even more. My father had been preparing his exit before he ever picked up the phone. Ethan slipped his hand into mine. "What do you want to do?" "Not, I'll fix it." "Not, let's call him." "Just, what do you want?" That was Ethan. He never rushed to solve my pain. He stood beside me until I found my own footing. "I don't want to walk alone." "You won't." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He smiled gently. "My mom asked me something 2 weeks ago." "What?" "If your father changed his mind?" I frowned. "My mother asked who she'd like to see walk you." My heartbeat slowed. "What did you tell her?" I said there was only one person. I already knew, even before he spoke the name. My grandfather, Walter Carter, 71, retired cabinet maker, Vidover, owner of the oldest woodworking shop in Williamson County, a man who measured lumber with impossible precision and loved people with effortless generosity. The first time I met Walter, I accidentally spilled sweet tea all over his workshop floor. Instead of getting upset, he laughed, handed me a broom, and said, "Well, now you've officially been adopted." Over the next 3 years, he quietly became part of my life. When my flower cooler broke during Mother's Day weekend, Walter rebuilt the shelves. When my delivery van refused to start, he drove 3 hours delivering wedding bouquets with me. When I opened my storefront, he carved the wooden sign hanging above the entrance himself. On the back, hidden where customers could never see, he carved 3 tiny words, "Built with love." I ran my fingers across those words every morning before unlocking the shop. He never knew I did. That evening, I drove to his workshop. The lights were still on. Sawdust floated through golden afternoon sunlight. Classic country music played softly from an old radio. Walter looked up from a workbench. "Claire." He smiled immediately. "Kiddo." I smiled back. Then stopped. He noticed instantly. He always did. Something happened. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "My dad isn't walking me." Walter slowly removed his work gloves, set them neatly on the bench, walked toward me. "What happened?" I explained everything. Emily, the phone call, the grandchildren, the ultimatum, the silence. He listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he stood there quietly, then asked only one question. "What do you need?" I swallowed hard. My voice almost disappeared. I was wondering if... He smiled before I finished. "I'd be honored." No hesitation. No surprise. No conditions. Just those 4 words. "I'd be honored." Tears blurred my vision. "I don't want to replace your dad," he said gently. I couldn't. "But if you'll let me, I'll make sure you never take that walk alone." I stepped forward and hugged him. His flannel shirt smelled like cedar wood, fresh coffee, and the workshop where he'd spent 40 years building beautiful things with his hands. He rested one rough hand gently against my shoulder. "You know something, kiddo?" "What?" "The luckiest fathers aren't always the ones listed on the birth certificate." When I drove home that evening, for the first time all week, I wasn't thinking about who had chosen not to show up. I was thinking about the man who said yes. Before I'd even finished asking, Walter insisted on driving me home. Not because my truck wouldn't make it. Because, as he put it, nobody should drive alone after someone breaks their heart. It wasn't a dramatic sentence. He said it the same way he talked, about replacing a loose fence post or sharpening a chisel, like it was simply a fact. The 25-minute drive passed mostly in silence. Comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand conversation to prove someone cares. As we pulled into my driveway, he switched off the engine but didn't reach for the door. "You know," he said, looking through the windshield, "I used to think being a father was something that happened all at once." I glanced at him. "But it doesn't." He smiled. "It happens in little pieces. A bike tire, a broken shelf, a first job, a phone call at midnight." He rubbed his rough thumb across the steering wheel. "Sometimes it even happens to someone else's child." I felt my throat tighten. "You've never been someone else's child to me." Inside the house, Ethan was making chili. His version of cooking involved using every pot we owned. The kitchen looked like a minor natural disaster. Walter laughed. "I taught you better than this. You taught me woodworking. I also taught you dishes." Clearly that lesson didn't stick. For the next hour, the 3 of us cooked together. Walter chopped onions. Ethan argued with the recipe. I baked cornbread. Nobody mentioned my parents. Nobody had to. Some hurts become smaller, simply because you're surrounded by people who refuse to make them the center of the room. The next morning, my maid of honor, Sophie Grant, burst into the flower shop carrying 2 coffees and enough energy to power a small town. She didn't bother knocking. She never had. I heard. I looked up from trimming eucalyptus. "How?" "Ethan." I nodded. "He figured you'd need caffeine." He was right. She handed me my coffee. "Your father is an idiot." "Sophie." "What?" "I didn't say he was a bad man. I said he made an idiot decision." There was a difference. One I hadn't been able to explain to anyone else. My father wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He simply spent his entire life avoiding conflict. Unfortunately, Avoiding conflict usually meant sacrificing whichever person complained the least. That person had almost always been me. Sophie leaned against the counter. Can I tell you something? Always. I remember your 12th birthday. I laughed softly. Why? Because your sister got braces that week. Oh. She nodded. You had 12 girls at your birthday party. I remember. We waited almost an hour before your parents came outside. I hadn't thought about that day in years. But suddenly, it all came back. I had wanted a garden party. Nothing fancy. Lemonade, cupcakes, a scavenger hunt around our backyard. Grandma had helped me plant sunflowers along the fence that spring. I thought they'd make perfect decorations. Instead, Emily came downstairs crying because she hated how braces made her look. Mom spent the afternoon comforting her. Dad drove her for ice cream. My birthday guests played games alone in the yard while my grandmother tried desperately to keep everyone entertained. When my parents finally appeared, Dad smiled. Sorry, sweetheart. Emily had a rough day. The birthday cake had already melted around the edges. Grandma lit the candles anyway. She whispered something while everyone sang, only loud enough for me to hear. Never measure your worth by someone else's attention. I hadn't understood those words then. I did now. Sophie interrupted my thoughts. You know what your grandmother told me that afternoon? I shook my head. She said, Claire grows flowers because flowers never compete with each other. I smiled. That sounded exactly like Grandma Eleanor. Business kept me busy most of Thursday. 3 wedding consultations, 2 delivery orders, 1 frantic bride who couldn't decide between ivory roses and white roses. They're practically identical, I told her. They're emotionally different. She stared at me. I don't know what that means. Neither do most brides. She laughed. So did I. For almost an entire afternoon, I forgot about my family. It felt wonderful. That evening, my phone buzzed. Emily. The first time she'd contacted me all week. I stared at the screen. Finally, I answered. Hello. Claire. She sounded perfectly calm. Almost cheerful. I heard Walter Carter is walking you. News traveled fast in Franklin. Yes. There was a short silence. Then, don't you think that's a little dramatic? I closed my eyes. Dramatic? People are going to talk. They're already talking. You could just walk alone. I don't want to. You'll embarrass Dad. I actually laughed. Not loudly. Just once. A tired little laugh. You think I'm embarrassing Dad? People will assume he abandoned you. I didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, I realized something astonishing. She genuinely believed appearances mattered more than actions. She wasn't worried about what he'd done. She was worried people would notice it. Emily. What? He did abandon me. Silence. I didn't make that happen. He did. Her voice sharpened. You've always loved playing the victim. I looked around my flower shop. Hundreds of bouquets. Invoices. Garden sketches. Payroll reports. Employees who depended on me. A business I'd built from nothing. There was nothing victim-like about my life. I don't think we've been living in the same family. What does that mean? It means, I spoke slowly, so you hear every word. You've spent 36 years believing everything belongs to you. Mom, Dad, the holidays, the grandchildren, the attention, and now, you wanted my wedding too. She inhaled sharply. I never asked for your wedding. No, you asked for my father. The silence after that lasted nearly 20 seconds. Finally, she whispered, I just didn't want to feel invisible. Something inside me softened. Only a little, because, for the first time, she sounded honest, not manipulative, just tired. I answered quietly, Emily, I spent my whole childhood invisible. She didn't reply. Neither of us knew what came after that. The call ended without goodbye. Friday morning arrived bright and cold, 24 hours until the wedding. Walter texted me at exactly 7:12 a.m. Tie looks crooked. I've fixed it 3 times already. Might fix it again. I laughed out loud. Then another message appeared. Still honored. I looked at those 2 words for a long time. Still honored. Not obligated. Not pressured. Honored. Some people make you feel like loving you is a burden. Others make you feel like it's a privilege. The difference changes your whole life. Friday afternoon felt strangely peaceful. The kind of peaceful that comes only after you've stopped, expecting people to become someone they have never been. My phone stayed mostly quiet. A few vendors, the bakery confirming delivery, The photographer asking if I still wanted sunset portraits by the old oak tree. I do, I told her. That tree has survived 3 tornadoes. Perfect, she laughed. So has my marriage. You aren't even married yet. Exactly. Around 3 o'clock, Walter pulled into the parking lot behind the flower studio. He climbed out of his old blue pickup carrying a long wooden box, not gift-wrapped, just smooth walnut with brass hinges. I made something. You always do. He grinned. I get nervous when my hands aren't busy. Inside the box lay a hand-carved hanger. Solid maple. Simple, elegant. Across the bottom, burned carefully into the wood, were 6 words. For the beginning of beautiful things, I traced the lettering with my fingertips. You made this. Couldn't let that fancy dress hang on plastic. I laughed, then hugged him. Again. You spoil me. No. He shook his head. I invest wisely. We spent the next 2 hours loading flowers into the refrigerated trailer. White roses, dusty blue delphiniums, eucalyptus, cream dahlias, late-season cosmos from a local farm. Every centerpiece had been designed by hand. Every bouquet wrapped with soft ivory silk ribbon. Walter never once acted like arranging. Flowers was less important than building cabinets. Instead, he studied each arrangement like it deserved respect. You know, he said while lifting another crate, woodworking and gardening aren't that different. They're not? No. You spend months preparing so somebody else can enjoy something for years. I smiled. That's actually beautiful. He shrugged. I've had 71 years to think about it. At 6 that evening, Ethan arrived carrying takeout. Barbecue, cornbread, sweet tea, wedding rehearsal fuel, he announced. The rehearsal itself was held inside the old barn, where we'd be married the next day. Warm string lights hung from thick wooden beams. The October sunset poured through the open sides of the building, turning everything amber. Friends gathered slowly. Laughter echoed through the room. People hugged. Someone tested the microphone. Children ran between empty chairs, pretending the aisle was a racetrack. It already felt like family. Walter stood quietly near the entrance, straightening chairs, checking table legs, helping the rental company move benches. No one had asked him. He simply noticed things that needed doing. That was who he was. The wedding coordinator finally laughed. Mr. Carter, you know you're the guest of honor, right? He scratched the back of his neck. I've never been very good at standing still. Then, something unexpected happened. The large barn doors opened. My parents walked inside. Together, conversation around the room softened. Not stopped. Just shifted. My father looked older than he'd seemed 4 days earlier. His shoulders sagged. My mother wore a navy dress and the careful expression she always wore when entering a room where she suspected she might not be admired. Emily followed a few steps behind them. Alone. No husband. No children. No smile. For a moment, none of us moved. The coordinator walked toward them. Oh, welcome. Please sign in. My mother smiled politely. We're here for the rehearsal. The coordinator checked her clipboard, then frowned. I'm sorry. There isn't a reservation for rehearsal dinner. There wasn't, because after Tuesday, Ethan and I had quietly finalized the guest list. Only people participating in the ceremony. Only people celebrating the marriage. Not people attending out of obligation. Mom blinked. There must be some mistake. There isn't. She looked directly at me. Claire. I walked over calmly. Hi. My father opened his mouth first. We thought. I know. He stopped. Mom tried next. We're your parents. You are. We assumed we'd still rehearse. I nodded. I understand. Then smiled gently. But Walter is rehearsing with me. Silence. Real silence. Walter looked horrified, as though he wanted nothing more than to disappear and avoid causing pain. I glanced toward him. He immediately looked away, almost apologetically. I hated that, because he'd done absolutely nothing wrong. Emily folded her arms. So that's it? I looked at her. What? You replaced Dad. No. I accepted someone who never left. She flinched. Dad lowered his eyes. Mom spoke carefully. People make mistakes. They do. So you're punishing us? No. I'm protecting tomorrow. She stared. What does that mean? It means... I looked around the barn. At Ethan laughing with his cousins. At Sophie adjusting centerpieces. At Walter quietly pretending not to hear any of this. At Ruth, Walter's lifelong neighbor, who had driven nearly an hour just to help decorate. Everyone here had shown up because they wanted to, not because appearances required it. "I only want peace tomorrow," I said softly. "And peace doesn't begin with another argument." Dad finally looked directly at me. "I'd still like to come." "You should." "I'd still like to see you get married." "I'd like that too." His eyes brightened. For just a second, then I finished. "As guests, nothing more, nothing less." His shoulders fell again, not dramatically, just enough to show he understood. Walter quietly walked over. He stopped beside my father, extended one weathered hand. "Richard." Dad looked surprised. "You know my name?" "I've known it for years." Dad shook his hand. Walter smiled kindly. "I hope you'll stay tomorrow." "I really do." Richard swallowed. I don't know what to say," Walter answered before anyone else could. "You don't have to compete with me. I'm not trying to take your place. I'm just making sure Claire isn't alone." There wasn't a trace of arrogance in his voice. Only kindness, which somehow made the moment even harder. Because kindness leaves very little room for excuses. The rehearsal began 15 minutes later. Walter practiced walking beside me exactly once. Slow, steady. Halfway down the aisle, he whispered, "You walk a little faster when you're nervous." "I do?" "Mm-hmm. I've noticed." "When?" "The first day you met Ethan." I laughed. "You remember that?" "I remember everything important." As everyone applauded after the rehearsal, I glanced toward the back of the barn. Dad was still standing there, watching, not me. Walter, watching the man who would do tomorrow what he'd chosen not to do. And for the first time in my entire life, I thought my father finally understood that the greatest losses aren't taken from us. Sometimes we hand them away ourselves. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn sunlight. The kind of morning that makes the whole world seem freshly washed. I woke before my alarm, 5:18 a.m. For a few seconds, I forgot it was my wedding day. Then I saw the dress hanging from the maple hanger Walter had carved. For the beginning of beautiful things, I smiled. The house was quiet. I made coffee, opened the back door. The garden glistened with dew. Every flower bed held traces of the season that had built it. Purple asters, golden chrysanthemums, white anemones, plants I had spent years tending. Some people measured their lives in promotions or paychecks. I measured mine in things that continued growing after I stopped watching them. My phone buzzed. One message. "Walter, leaving now. I've checked my tie 5 times. Still think it's crooked." 30 seconds later, another message appeared. "Tell Ethan not to laugh if I cry." I laughed into my coffee, then typed back, "No promises." By 8 o'clock, the bridal suite buzzed with voices. Hairstylists, makeup artists, bridesmaids, coffee cups everywhere. Sophie somehow managed to organize 6 people at once while eating a cinnamon roll. "I deserve an award," she announced. "You deserve 2. No, I deserve paid vacation." Everyone laughed. The tension disappeared. Exactly what she intended. Around 10, Walter knocked softly on the dressing room door. "Can I come in?" Sophie opened it. He stepped inside wearing his charcoal suit. White shirt, deep blue tie, brown leather shoes polished so carefully they reflected the windows. For a long moment, he simply stared at me, then smiled. "Well, I'll be." "What?" I was expecting beautiful. He rubbed one eye. I wasn't prepared for breathtaking. The room became very quiet. He reached into his jacket pocket. "I almost forgot." He handed me a folded handkerchief. White linen, one corner embroidered with tiny blue flowers. "My wife stitched that." I looked up. "Margaret?" He nodded. "She embroidered it before our son was born." His voice softened. "I think she'd like you to carry it today." Tears filled my eyes instantly. I can't take something so precious. He smiled. "Kiddo, it isn't precious because it sat in a drawer. It's precious because someone who deserved it finally has it." I hugged him carefully, trying not to wrinkle his suit, trying much harder not to cry. The ceremony was scheduled for 1 o'clock. Guests began arriving shortly after noon. Nearly 200 people. Friends, neighbors, clients, former teachers, Ethan's enormous extended family. People wandered through the gardens, taking photographs beneath the maple trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. The entire venue smelled of cedar, fresh flowers, and cinnamon cider, exactly as I'd imagined. Sophie peeked through the curtains. "They're here." My parents? She nodded. They're sitting in the last row. Together? Yeah. And she hesitated. Emily's alone. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I was upset, because I suddenly realized I genuinely hoped they enjoyed the ceremony, without resentment, without competition. Just as witnesses, the string quartet began playing. Guests took their seats. The officiant stepped into position. Ethan waited beneath the wooden arbor we'd built together that summer. He looked impossibly handsome, but mostly, he looked peaceful, the kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly where you're supposed to be. Inside the bridal room, Walter offered his arm. You ready? I looked at him, then at the mirror, then back again. I think so, he chuckled. Good, because I've been ready since Wednesday. We stood behind the enormous barn doors. The music changed. Our cue. Walter leaned closer. You nervous? A little. So am I. You? Oh, absolutely. He smiled. I've built houses. Cabinets. Church pews. Never walked someone this important anywhere. I laughed through tears. I'm the lucky one. No. He shook his head gently. We both are. The doors slowly opened. Warm sunlight poured across the wooden floor. 200 guests turned at once. The room became completely silent. Walter squeezed my hand. Not tightly. Just enough to remind me he was there. We took the first step, then another. Every movement felt calm, measured, like neither of us wanted to rush something we'd remember forever. I noticed familiar faces. Sophie already crying. Ruth smiling proudly. Ethan's cousins grinning. Children leaning into the aisle for a better look. Then, without meaning to, my eyes drifted briefly toward the last row. Dad was watching us. Not angrily, not bitterly, simply watching. His hands were folded tightly together. Mom sat perfectly still beside him. Emily stared at the floor. No one looked away. Halfway down the aisle, Walter whispered, You know? What? I'm incredibly proud of you. 6 simple words. Words I'd spent most of my childhood hoping to hear from someone else. Unexpectedly, they no longer felt incomplete. Because they came from someone who meant every syllable. I squeezed his arm. Thank you. No. He smiled. Thank you for trusting me. When we reached the front, Walter turned toward Ethan. He placed my hand into his, then looked directly at him. Take good care of her. Ethan answered immediately. Every day. Walter nodded once. I know you will. Instead of immediately taking his seat, he did something I never expected. He leaned forward, kissed my forehead, and whispered, My daughter couldn't have looked more beautiful. For one impossible second, time stopped. Not because of applause, not because of tears, because a man who owed me nothing had just given me everything I'd spent 33 years wishing to hear. Then he smiled, walked quietly to the front row, and sat down. The ceremony had only just begun. The ceremony passed in the quiet way truly meaningful moments often do. No dramatic interruptions, no speeches from people trying to repair years of damage, just promises, real ones. When Ethan slipped the ring onto my finger, his hand trembled slightly. He smiled. I practiced this. It shows. I dropped the ring twice at home. I believe that. The guests laughed softly. The tension disappeared. For the first time all week, everything felt exactly as it should. When Reverend Collins pronounced us husband and wife, the applause started before she even finished the sentence. Ethan kissed me. Not quickly, not dramatically, just long enough to remind me that after everything, we had still arrived here. Together, the reception began under hundreds of tiny lights strung between the barn beams. Dinner was simple. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from local farms, homemade bread, apple pie instead of an elaborate wedding cake. Exactly what we wanted. People laughed. Children danced. Someone convinced Walter to try line dancing. He claimed he couldn't. 5 minutes later, he was doing it better than everyone else. About an hour into dinner, the band leader tapped the microphone. And now, a special dance. I immediately assumed it would be Ethan and his mother. Instead, Walter looked toward me. Oh, he whispered. I think this one's ours. The room applauded. He stood, walked toward me, and held out his hand. May I? You don't even have to ask. The band began playing a slow acoustic version of Stand By Me. Walter smiled nervously. I warned you. I've got 2 left feet. I'll survive. You say that now. We laughed, then started moving. Slowly, carefully. Neither of us cared whether we looked graceful. Halfway through the song, he quietly said, "I always wondered what it'd feel like." "What?" "Walking my daughter into her future." I looked at him. "You never told me that." "I didn't think life was going to give me another chance." He smiled. "Turns out, life sometimes builds different families than we expected." I rested my head lightly against his shoulder. "So does love." When the music ended, the applause seemed louder than before. Walter hugged me tightly, then quietly returned to his seat. He didn't try to stay in the spotlight. He never had. A few minutes later, someone touched my elbow. I turned. My father stood there, alone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted, older than 63, as if the last 4 days had taken years from him. Finally, he said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I should have walked you." "Yes." "I should have stood up to your mother." "Yes." "I should have stood up to Emily." Another quiet nod. "Yes." He looked down at his hands. "I've spent most of my life trying to keep everyone happy. And all I really did, it was disappoint the people who love me the most." I could hear the sincerity in his voice, maybe for the first time in years. "I'm sorry, Claire. I know sorry doesn't fix today." "It doesn't." He nodded. "I know. I didn't want today to end without saying it." I looked across the room. Walter was laughing with Ethan's cousins, teaching one of the little boys how to fold a paper airplane from a napkin, completely unaware that anyone was watching him. Then I looked back at my father. "I have a question." "Anything." "Do you know why everyone loves Walter?" Dad frowned slightly. "I think so." "No." I smiled gently. "They love him because he never asks what something will cost him before deciding whether to help." Dad closed his eyes. The words landed exactly where they needed to. "I don't know if we can fix everything," I said honestly. "Neither do I. But if we're ever going to try, you'll have to stop choosing the easiest person to disappoint." His eyes filled. "I understand. I hope you do." He surprised me then. He turned, walked across the room, stopped beside Walter. Walter immediately stood. My father extended his hand. "No." Walter smiled. "You don't owe me." "I do," Dad interrupted quietly. "You gave my daughter something I was too afraid to give her." Walter looked uncomfortable. "You don't need to thank me." "I do." My father swallowed. "And thank you for loving her when I made it difficult." Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, pulled my father into a brief hug. Not dramatic, not performative. Just two older men standing in the middle of a wedding reception, choosing grace over pride. When they stepped apart, neither one of them had dry eyes. Late that evening, after the guests had gone, after the lights had begun coming down, after the last table had been folded away, Ethan and I stood alone beneath the old maple tree beside the barn. Walter was loading chairs into his truck, even after we'd begged him not to. "I can't sit still," he insisted. "Some things never change." I walked over to help him. He shook his head. "Go enjoy being married. I can carry one chair. You've carried enough this week." I laughed. "So have you." He closed the truck door, looked at me for a long moment, then reached into his pocket. "I almost forgot." He handed me a tiny wooden heart, about the size of a coin, smooth maple. On one side were carved 3 simple words: "Always keep growing." I smiled through tears. "It matches the hanger." "It was supposed to." He grinned. "I figured every gardener needs a reminder." "I don't think I'll ever stop needing reminders." "You won't. Neither will I." That little wooden heart still sits on the shelf in my studio today, right beside the maple hanger, right beside the first photograph from our wedding. In the picture, I'm laughing. Ethan is looking at me. Walter is standing beside us with sawdust still caught on one sleeve of his suit. You can't see it unless you zoom in. I notice it every single time, because that's who he was. A man who never stopped building, even on the days meant for celebrating. People sometimes ask whether I ever forgave my parents. The answer is, eventually. But forgiveness didn't change history. It simply stopped history from deciding my future. My father never got another chance to walk me down the aisle. There aren't rehearsals for moments like that. Some doors only open once. But he did begin showing up afterward. Birthday dinners, Sunday lunches, quiet phone calls. not perfectly, just consistently. And consistency, I learned, is how trust grows back. Slowly, season by season. Much like a garden. Emily and I were never especially close again. But over time, we became honest. She finally admitted that losing her marriage had made her terrified of watching anyone else build the happy life she thought she'd lost. It didn't excuse what she'd done. It simply explained it. And sometimes, understanding is enough to let go. Not to return to what was, but to stop carrying it. If this story has taught me anything, it's that family isn't defined by the people who share your last name. Family is the person who answers before you've even finished asking. The one who shows up. The one who stays. The one who quietly builds a place where your heart can finally rest. Sometimes that person is your parent. Sometimes they aren't. But when you find them, hold on tightly. Because love isn't proven by blood. It's proven by presence.